A German tank commander sits in his Panther, watching through his periscope as 5 American Sherman tanks advance across a French field in the summer of 1944. He smiles. His Panther's 75mm gun can penetrate a Sherman's armor from over a mile away. Sherman's gun will barely scratch his frontal armor even at close range. He's fought Shermans before and won easily every time. This will be another easy victory. He orders his gunner to aim for the lead Sherman. But then he notices something that makes his smile disappear. Behind those 5 Shermans, there are 10 more. Behind those 10, there are 20 more. Behind those 20, he sees what looks like an endless stream of American tanks flowing across the countryside like a mechanical flood. His radio crackles with panicked reports from other German positions. Shermans everywhere, dozens of them, hundreds of them. And his single Panther, even with its superior armor and gun, can't fight them all. This is the story of how German officers learn the hard way that having the best tank doesn't matter when your enemy has 10 times as many tanks that are good enough. Let's start by understanding what German tank officers thought about the Sherman when they first encountered it. The Germans had been developing tank warfare since the 1930s. They pioneered Blitzkrieg tactics in Poland and France. Their tanks, especially the later models like the Panther and Tiger, were technologically impressive with thick armor, powerful guns, advanced optics. German engineers took tank design seriously, and it showed. When German tankers first faced Shermans in North Africa and Italy, their initial assessment was dismissive, bordering on contempt. The Sherman had thin armor compared to German heavy tanks. Its 75mm gun was adequate but not exceptional. It was tall, making it an easy target. It tended to catch fire when penetrated, which American crews grimly referred to as brewing up. German tank commanders who'd fought against Soviet T-34s and British Churchills found the Sherman to be inferior to both in certain respects. There are documented accounts of German officers calling the Sherman a death trap and a Tommy cooker. They couldn't understand why America, with all its industrial might, would produce such a seemingly mediocre tank. German military doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. They wanted the best equipment for their soldiers. The idea of mass-producing an adequate tank rather than a superior one didn't make sense to them. This contempt was reinforced by early engagements, where German tanks, especially the Tigers and Panthers, achieved favorable kill ratios against Shermans. A single Tiger could knock out multiple Shermans before being destroyed. This fed the German narrative that their tanks were simply better and that American tactics and equipment were inferior. But what German officers failed to understand was the strategic calculation behind the Sherman's design. The Sherman wasn't designed to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was intended to be good enough while being reliable, easy to produce, maintain, and transport. American military planners understood something fundamental that German planners didn't fully appreciate. Modern industrial warfare isn't won by having the best individual weapons. It's won by having enough good weapons to overwhelm the enemy while keeping your forces supplied and operational. The Sherman embodied this philosophy perfectly. Let's discuss what made the Sherman actually effective at what it was designed to do. First, reliability. The Sherman used a proven gasoline engine that was simple to maintain. It didn't break down constantly like some German tanks that used complex and temperamental engines. Sherman crews could count on their tanks to start every morning and keep running all day. German tanks, especially late-war models, were notorious for mechanical failures. A Panther might be superior in a one-on-one fight, but if half your Panthers are broken down in the motor pool, that superiority doesn't matter. Second, the Sherman was designed with crew survivability in mind despite its reputation. It had good crew ergonomics, escape hatches, and while it could burn when hit, so could every other tank of the era. The wet stowage system, introduced in later Shermans, dramatically reduced fire risk by storing ammunition in liquid-filled containers. Third, the Sherman had excellent visibility for the crew. The commander had a cupola with good all-around vision. The driver had decent forward visibility. This might not sound important, but in tank combat, seeing the enemy first is often the difference between killing and being killed. Fourth, the Sherman had a stabilized gun, which was revolutionary at the time. This allowed it to fire accurately while moving, something German tanks couldn't do. In the fluid, fast-moving battles that characterized the campaign in France and Germany, this was a huge advantage. Fifth, the Sherman had a power traverse for the turret, meaning it could rotate the turret quickly and precisely. German tanks often had manual traverse, which was slower and more exhausting for the crew. These features didn't make headlines, but they made the Sherman effective in actual combat conditions. Now let's talk about production and logistics, because this is where the Sherman really shone and where German contempt proved most misguided. America produced approximately 50,000 Shermans during World War II. 50,000. That's not a typo. Germany produced about 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. Even if you add all German tank production, they made maybe 25,000 tanks total during the war. America made twice that number of just Shermans, plus thousands of other armored vehicles. The production numbers alone should have terrified German planners, but many German officers didn't fully grasp what those numbers meant on the battlefield until it was too late. But production is only part of the story. The Sherman was designed to be transportable. It was narrow enough to fit on standard rail cars and light enough to cross most bridges without collapsing them. It could be shipped across the Atlantic efficiently and landed on beaches during amphibious invasions. German heavy tanks were so big and heavy that moving them was a logistical nightmare. Railways had to be reinforced. Special trains were needed. Bridges couldn't support them. Panthers and Tigers were often stranded because the infrastructure to move them didn't exist or had been destroyed by Allied bombing. The Sherman's transportability meant it could be everywhere it was needed. German tanks were often somewhere they couldn't reach. Maintenance and spare parts were another advantage of the Sherman. The Sherman used many standardized parts. If something broke, spare parts were available and mechanics knew how to fix it. The supply chain worked. German tanks, especially late-war models, used custom parts that were hard to replace. If a specific component broke, that tank might be out of action for weeks, waiting for a replacement part that might never come. German tank crews often had to cannibalize parts from other broken tanks just to keep one tank running. This is no way to maintain an armored force. The Sherman's logistical superiority meant that a higher percentage of Shermans were operational at any given time compared to German tanks. It doesn't matter how good your tank is if it's sitting broken in a field. Let's talk about what happened when these two approaches to tank warfare met on the battlefield in large-scale operations. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 is when German officers really started to understand their mistake. Initially, German defenses made the fighting brutal for Allied forces. German tanks and anti-tank guns inflicted heavy casualties on Shermans in the bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy. For a few weeks, it looked like German contempt for the Sherman might be justified. But then American forces broke out in late July during Operation Cobra. Suddenly, hundreds of Sherman tanks were streaming across France in massive armored columns. German defenders found themselves facing overwhelming numbers. A German tank company might have 10 or 15 tanks. They'd engage American forces and destroy several Shermans. But then more Shermans would appear, and more, and more. German tanks would run out of ammunition before the Americans ran out of tanks. German formations would be bypassed and surrounded by the flood of American armor, which moved faster than German commanders could react. The tactical superiority of individual German tanks became strategically irrelevant because they were simply outnumbered to an absurd degree. German officers who'd mocked the Sherman were now desperately calling for reinforcements that didn't exist because Germany couldn't replace their tank losses at anything close to the rate America could. There's a famous account from a German tank commander named Otto Karius who wrote a memoir after the war. He describes fighting against American armor and his frustration at the numbers. He'd knock out 3 or 4 Shermans, but 6 more would take their place. His Tiger could dominate individual engagements, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. American tactics evolved to exploit this. They'd use some Shermans to pin down German tanks from the front, while other Shermans maneuvered to attack from the flanks or rear, where even Tigers and Panthers were vulnerable. This swarming tactic worked because the Americans had enough tanks to coordinate complex multi-directional attacks. The Battle of Aracourt in September 1944 is a perfect example of how American armor, despite being individually inferior to German tanks, achieved a decisive victory through numbers and tactics. The 4th Armored Division, equipped entirely with Shermans, faced off against the 5th Panzer Army, which included Panthers and other German armor. On paper, the Panthers had every advantage. In practice, American tankers used their superior numbers, better coordination, and knowledge of the terrain to defeat the German force decisively. The Americans destroyed or damaged hundreds of German tanks while losing far fewer of their own. German officers were stunned. How did inferior tanks win such a decisive victory? The answer was combined arms warfare and numerical superiority working together. American commanders didn't just send Shermans forward alone. They coordinated tanks with infantry, artillery, and increasingly effective close air support. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers were devastating against German armor. When German tanks tried to maneuver against American forces, they risked being spotted and destroyed from the air. This forced German armor to be cautious and defensive, which negated many of their tactical advantages. Meanwhile, American tanks could advance aggressively, knowing they had massive fire support available. The Sherman wasn't fighting alone. It was part of an integrated system that multiplied its effectiveness. Let's also discuss the evolution of American tank crews in the war. Early in the North Africa campaign, American tankers were inexperienced and made mistakes. By 1944, American tank crews were skilled veterans who understood their equipment and how to use it effectively. They learned that Sherman's advantages, speed, reliability, and gun stabilization could be exploited. They developed tactics specifically designed to overcome Sherman's weaknesses. They'd use speed and maneuverability to get close to German tanks quickly, negating the range advantage of German guns. They'd coordinate attacks so multiple Shermans engaged a single German tank from different angles. They'd use terrain cleverly, attacking from positions where German tanks couldn't bring their superior guns to bear effectively. There's also the matter of variants and improvements. The basic Sherman with the 75 gun was adequate but not ideal against heavy German armor. So the Americans developed the Sherman Firefly with the British 17-pounder gun, which could penetrate German heavy tanks at reasonable ranges. They developed the M4A3E8 Sherman with improved suspension and the 76 gun that was more effective against armor. They added armor plates to vulnerable areas. They constantly improved the design based on combat experience. German tanks were also improved over time, but German production was so limited and logistics so strained that many improvements never reached the front in significant numbers. By late 1944 and into 1945, German tank commanders were no longer mocking the Sherman. They were terrified of American armored forces because they knew what was coming. Waves of tanks they couldn't stop, aggressive tactics they couldn't counter, supply lines they couldn't match. The contempt had turned to respect mixed with despair. German after-action reports from this period frequently mention being overwhelmed by American armor. They describe fighting well, destroying many enemy tanks, and still losing because there were always more Americans coming. The strategic situation had become hopeless, and German officers were aware of it. There's an interesting psychological aspect to this as well. Early German contempt for the Sherman was partly based on their own success with quality-focused design. German engineering culture valued precision, sophistication, and even over-engineering. The Sherman was the opposite. It was simple, practical, and mass-produced. To German engineers and officers raised in a culture that valued craftsmanship and technical superiority, the Sherman looked crude. They couldn't see past the surface to understand the strategic brilliance of its design philosophy. This cultural blind spot contributed to their underestimation of American armor and industrial capacity more broadly. American industrial philosophy was fundamentally different. It was based on mass production, interchangeable parts, and continuous improvement. This philosophy came from American automotive manufacturing. The Sherman was built using techniques developed by Ford and General Motors for building cars. This allowed rapid production at scale, something Germany never achieved despite their technical sophistication. American workers could produce multiple Shermans in the time it took German workers to produce one Panther. This wasn't because American workers were better. It was because the design and production process was optimized for speed and efficiency rather than perfection. Let's discuss specific battles that illustrate the evolution of German thinking about American armor. At Kasserine Pass in North Africa in early 1943, German forces under Rommel inflicted a sharp defeat on inexperienced American forces. German tanks and tactics were superior, and it showed. This fed German confidence about American military capabilities. But by the time of the breakout from Normandy in late 1944, the situation was completely reversed. American forces were operationally competent, well-supplied, and overwhelming in numbers. The Germans were fighting desperately just to avoid complete collapse. The contrast between these two battles shows how quickly American forces learned and adapted, while German forces, despite their tactical skill, couldn't overcome strategic disadvantages. The crossing of the Rhine in early 1945 demonstrated the final evolution of American armored warfare. American forces crossed the Rhine River, which the Germans had expected to be a major defensive barrier, with relative ease. Sherman tanks poured across bridges before the Germans could destroy them and fanned out across Germany. German resistance was still fierce in places, but it was hopeless. There weren't enough German tanks to stop the American advance. There wasn't enough fuel to maneuver what tanks they had. Replacement parts were unavailable. Trained crews were scarce. Meanwhile, American armored divisions were at full strength, well-supplied, and aggressive. The war was effectively over, but the fighting continued for weeks because German leadership refused to accept reality. German tank aces, who survived the war and wrote memoirs, consistently mention American numerical superiority as the decisive factor. They describe individual battles where German technical superiority meant nothing because they were fighting against impossible odds. Some express admiration for American logistics and industrial capacity, even while criticizing American tactical doctrine or equipment. The honest ones acknowledge that Germany lost the tank war not because German tanks were bad, but because Germany couldn't produce and sustain enough of them to matter. The Sherman was not won by being the best tank, but by being good enough and available in overwhelming numbers. There's a broader lesson here about military strategy and industrial warfare. German military thinking emphasized quality, technical superiority, elite formations, and wonder weapons. This worked brilliantly in short, sharp campaigns where German advantages could be decisive before logistics became a factor. But in a long war of attrition against opponents with superior industrial capacity, this approach was doomed. The Sherman represents the opposite philosophy, designed for mass production. Accept good enough instead of perfect. Focus on reliability and sustainability. Overwhelm the enemy with numbers and logistics. This philosophy won the war. Modern military historians recognize that the Sherman was actually a perfect tank for its intended purpose. It wasn't designed to win one-on-one duels against Tigers. It was intended to be produced quickly, maintained easily, transporting efficiently, and used in large numbers by average crews to achieve operational objectives. By those measures, it was one of the most successful tanks ever built. The fact that German officers initially mocked it shows how badly they misunderstood the nature of the war they were fighting. They were thinking about individual combat effectiveness. They should have been thinking about sustained industrial warfare. The Sherman's success also validated American military doctrine more broadly. American forces in World War II emphasized flexibility, combined arms coordination, and overwhelming material superiority. They didn't try to match the Germans in tactical sophistication or individual unit quality. They built an integrated military machine that could sustain operations indefinitely and adapt to changing circumstances. The Sherman was a perfect embodiment of this approach. It worked with infantry, artillery, and air power as part of a system. It could be repaired and resupplied reliably. It could be improved incrementally based on combat experience. This systemic approach defeated German tactical excellence because tactics without strategy and logistics ultimately failed to succeed. So what's the final assessment? The Sherman wasn't perfect. American tank crews who fought in them understood the risks and the limitations. Many wished they had better armor protection or a more powerful gun. Those criticisms are valid, and the high casualty rates among American tank crews were tragic. But in the context of winning the war, the Sherman was exactly what America needed. It allowed American forces to field massive armored formations that German forces couldn't match. It could be produced fast enough to replace losses and expand formations. It was reliable enough to sustain high-tempo operations. It was simple enough for rapidly trained crews to operate effectively. These characteristics won the war in Europe far more effectively than having a smaller number of technically superior tanks ever could have. The German mockery of the Sherman was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of how industrial wars are won. They saw a tank that was individually inferior to their best designs and assumed it was inferior. What they didn't see was the system behind that tank, the factories that could produce it by the thousands, the supply chain that could keep it running, the doctrine that could employ it effectively. The industrial economy could sustain production indefinitely. By the time German officers understood what they were really facing, it was far too late. The Sherman swarm had already overwhelmed them, and the war was lost. If this story changed how you think about the Sherman tank and American strategy in World War II, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're bringing you the real stories behind the weapons and tactics that shaped history, the strategic thinking that won wars, and the industrial might that made victory possible. Don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching. Remember, in modern warfare, good enough in overwhelming numbers beats perfect in limited quantities every single time.